I'm excited about this. I've seen Nina present, and she's very energetic and lively, and she's brilliant, and she does fascinating research. So, and we have these wonderful guests from NIA as well. Since 1990, Dr. Nina Kraus has been the Hugh Knowles Professor in the Departments of Communication Sciences, Neurobiology and Physiology, and Otolaryngology. I got it out. Otolaryngology, which is ear, nose, and throat. It would have been obvious if I'd given you the full title, which is Otorhinolaryngology. Please say that with me. Oh, never mind. Okay. Dr. Kraus is the director of the Auditory Neuroscience Laboratory at Northwestern University, where she and her team research the biological underpinnings of audio perception. So she gets into the realm of speech, how we process sound in order to do verbal communication, and obviously also in music, and how and why we process music. She studies a variety of animal and human models. She looks at audio perception in clinical populations, so she's looking at folks who are struggling with things like dyslexia, autism, hearing loss. And she also studies audio experts, musicians, people who have been trained in music for their full lives. And of course, she looks at normal listeners and what happens to audio perception across a lifespan, which is becoming increasingly important to me as I begin to have difficulty hearing voice in crowds. And like the best of scientists, Nina is motivated by translational issues. That is, how she can take what she and her team are learning in the lab and get it out into the field where we can actually try to improve our ability to communicate with each other. She has a wonderful website, which she'll tell you about, but really you should check it out, brainvolts.northwestern.edu. It's a wonderful website. Without further ado, let me hear you give a nice warm welcome to Dr. Nina Kraus.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank all of you for being here. And I will do my very best to tell you about the work that we're doing. So this is about art and the brain and a step in time. But this is about how music experience and the adult brain intersect. So here's a little roadmap. I'm going to talk about lifelong musical experience and how it enhances communication and biology. I'm a biologist by training. And I will tell you about the work that we've done in people who have studied music throughout their lives, but the spotlight here is going to be on older adults. And I want to tell you about our particular biological approach because it is a little bit unusual, and I'd like you to appreciate it. Then I'm going to talk about aging, and aging brings with it some communication challenges, and we're trying to understand the underlying biology there. We do know quite a bit about what happens to our nervous systems as we get older from animal models and from work in humans. And we know that musical experience can help offset some of the effects of aging. Lifelong experience, what happens. So on the one hand, what happens if you continue to play music throughout your life? A little bit. By the way, when I talk about a musician here, my definition of a musician is somebody who plays music a minimum of twice a week for 20 minutes and does so regularly. So these are not professional musicians. These are people for whom music is a solid, steady part of their lives. What about the impact of musical experience early in life? How does what we do early on impact the adult brain? And then what about hearing loss? Because it's one of the things that happens as we get older. We get hearing loss, and how does musical experience intersect with that? I'm going to finish with some research gaps and future directions, and I hope you'll see that I will be making a case for music and healthy aging. So, musical experience will confer advantages in hearing and noise, auditory memory, and speed of processing. All of these are important for communication. These are all important communication skills. Thank you. And again, being a biologist, what I want to tell you about is not only these communication skills, but tell you about the biological evidence. So music is biologically powerful. When we think about evolution, we think, I can't ever even think on these scales, because in my daily life, I'm dealing with microseconds. Okay, I mean, speech and music, the timing in speech and music is on millisecond, microsecond timing, and evolution is, millennia, and I just lose track of how many zeros are there. But what happens with music is that music has the power to transform evolutionarily. We can think of our bodies as an evolutionary experiment, and that throughout our lifetime, our body, our nervous system is changed by the experiences, by what we do. And so if you think about hearing, we know that sound will, of course, enter our ears and go into our brain. We also know that there are pathways that feed from all the far reaches of our nervous system, of our brain, all the way back to our ear, and informs our sensory systems based on the experiences that happen. How we pay attention and remember sound, so in other words, cognitively, how we engage with sound, is very important also with respect to how our nervous system then just encodes sound. How we feel about sound is, again, another very important ingredient that is kind of amazing when you think that it impacts the very basic way in which our nervous system responds to sound. And we all know that we learn what we care about. We know from animal work that animals will learn so much faster and remember so much longer if, while they are learning, you are stimulating the emotional centers in their nervous system. And so our cognitive, our sensory, our emotional systems are all intertwined in a circuit. And music really engages these cognitive, sensory, and reward circuits. And so if you had to say what it is that my lab studies, really the one word that sums it up is learning. And one of the reasons that I am so interested in music, and music is just interesting, and I love it. Actually, my mother was a musician. I'm married to a musician, and I play a little bit, not particularly well, but with great joy. And it turns out that music is just a fabulous model for learning. It's the quintessential model for learning. Because when you are learning to play music, you are making sound to meaning connections. What do I mean? So here's an example. You got Dad. He's listening to his baby's cry. And after a while, he learns the sound of his own baby's crying. And in time, I mean, if you're parents, you can know if a kid is crying in a supermarket, oh, it's not my baby. But Dad learns to recognize the sound of his baby's cry, and he can confidently pick out that baby's cry. This is, again, a signal-to-noise situation where you're picking out a relevant piece of information out of a complex soundscape, and of course, he can do with that information whatever he wants. Yeah, run the other way. But with music, musicians are constantly mapping sound to meaning. So there are all kinds of relationships. There are harmonic relationships. There are, the value of notes on a score. There's crescendo, diminuendo. There are just so many different aspects of meaning in sound that you are forced to engage with. There's tonality, there are historic sounds, there are motifs that we learn to recognize. So this is all sound to meaning. As a consequence, what we have learned, and this is work that we have done and work that the field has done worldwide, because now there really has been a bit of an explosion on what is the effect of musical experience on the nervous system and on communication skills. And we have learned that musicians have stronger listening and auditory cognitive skills. And I'm going to go through this in some detail. And we have studied this now cross-sectionally across the lifespan, actually beginning in toddlers, school-age kids, young adults, and older adults. So I'm going to give you two examples. First, I'm going to talk about hearing a noise, and then I'm going to talk about memory before I get to the biology. So hearing a noise, musicians are constantly trying to analyze sound and to pick out meaning from a complex soundscape. So here are the 3 bops. You can find them on YouTube. They are all listening to the sound of their own instrument. So, when you play a musical instrument, you're listening for the sound of your instrument. You're listening for a harmony line, a melody line. And we wondered, would this skill transfer to hearing a noise, which is also picking out your friend's voice from a noisy restaurant. It is picking out the relevant meaning out of a complicated soundscape. And the answer is resoundingly yes. So across the lifespan, we have data where we have people listening to sounds in noise. So they are listening to sounds, and people are hollering and talking in the background, and they have to repeat back the sentences. Tell me if you can repeat back the sentence you hear. Anybody? Sugar. Something about sugar. Good for you. Anyway, the sentence in there is sugar is very sweet. And you can hear it in another example where the background noise is not quite as loud, and so the sentence pops out. But this is the kind of test, these are standardized tests of hearing a noise that we perform with people across the lifespan. Okay, so let's talk about memory. Music and memory. For a long time, music has had a very privileged role in memory. And before people wrote down history, we had bards who would sing about the history of what had come before. And we know that music is very sticky. You never get a sentence stuck in your head. And so there really is a very privileged role for music and memory. And this is important. So why is that? So musical training involves the memorization of sound and visual patterns. It involves the memorization of auditory and motor sequences. Just to tune your instrument, you have to listen to the sound, the note, hold it in your mind, and then tune the instrument. To improvise, if you have a musical idea and I'm going to improvise upon it, I have to remember what it is that you just played so that then I can improvise upon it. This is auditory working memory. The reason that you are getting any meaning, I hope, out of what I'm telling you right now is because you have auditory working memory. You can remember what I just said a few seconds ago. You're holding it in your mind while you're listening to what I'm saying right now. Auditory working memory is so important to our communication skills. So all of this exercise is memory, and again, we have seen across the lifespan that school-age kids, young adults, and older adults just do better on measures of auditory working memory, standardized measures of auditory working memory. And again, so we see this across the lifespan. I want to give you a personal example. So one of the things that happens when you are playing music or trying to learn a piece is, well, you can take dictation. You have to hold that in your mind. One of the things that I do as a guitarist is I'll listen to something that I want to learn how to play, hold it in my mind while I'm trying to resolve the physical complexity of playing what it is that I'm trying to play. And then, of course, I'll forget. And then I'll have to listen to it again. But the whole time, I'm really exercising my auditory working memory. And I want to give you an example. It's very obvious when Chuck is playing and when I am playing. But this is the kind of way that when you learn music, you are exercising your auditory working memory. So, and this is after one or two tries. Okay, so these are communication benefits. We really want to understand what are the biological underpinnings so that we can make use of what it is that we know and, again, use this information to make life better. So what is the evidence? So there's been quite a bit of work showing that anatomically, musical experience will change fundamental parts of the nervous system. And so this is work that has been done by others. So we know that certain areas of the nervous system are enhanced. So our auditory motor systems, our auditory systems, the motor system just by itself, connections between the hemispheres. We know that the motor systems in people who play instruments are more symmetric. So there is better bimanual, if you will, coordination. We know that areas of gray matter, areas of white matter are simply enhanced in people who play musical instruments. And yes, the earlier you play, the stronger the effects. These are also effects that the more years you play, the larger the effects. And the cerebellum, which is the little brain, it's called, also is very important for our coordination, and that is also an area of the nervous system. So it really is it's not as though if you are a musician, the way I'm defining a musician, it's not as though your whole brain is bigger and everything will explode, but it's rather just the very specific parts of the nervous system that are important for the processing and integrating of sound that become enhanced. Neurophysiologically, one of my favorite studies is these folks looked at the physiologic representation of the two hands, and they looked at string players. And of course, if you're a string player, you use your left hand in a different way than you use your right hand, and there are more intense demands on your left hand. And it turns out that within the same person as their own control, you see that the representation of their left hand is enhanced compared to the representation, the neural representation. The amount of neural geography, if you will, that is given up to the left hand is greater than for the right hand in a string player. This is where I'm coming from years ago, and we still have animal models. We stuck needles in bunny rabbit brains and asked, okay, so how do cells respond to sound, to single neurons? Then we taught the animal something, that the sound would mean that something would happen. And what we found is that, in fact, the response of just an individual neuron changes as a function of experience in the animal. And so this is very direct biological evidence that you can get in animal models on the single cell level. You can't be sticking needles into people's brains. So how do you access biology in humans? And we have been working very, very hard at this. And I think we've made considerable inroads. So this is our biological approach, and it has a number of important attributes. First of all, you need to understand that the approach, the way that we capture the neural activity is with scalp electrodes. So we just put electrodes on with the kids, we call them buttons. We put them on their heads, and we measure the nervous system's response to sound. Of course, as I'm talking to you now, the nerves in your brain that respond to sound are giving off electricity, and we can capture that electricity. Electricity is the currency of the nervous system, right? So we are able to capture the acoustic characteristics of sound. This metric is experience dependent, and it is meaningful in individuals. Now, what do I mean by these things? Okay, capturing the acoustic characteristics of the sound. Here is a sound wave. This happens to be da. Da. And this is the brain wave. And you can notice that the brain wave and the sound wave actually physically resemble each other. So from a biological standpoint, we're not talking about some pharmacologic, abstract, even when we're recording from single neurons or we're looking at images in the brain. These are very abstract representations of the sound, of the acoustics of sound. And we know that speech and music are made up of pitch and timing and timbre and very measurable aspects of sound, and we can see them reflected in the brainwave. You can actually take the brainwave, play it back through a speaker, and it will sound like the sound wave. So that was the nervous system at the end. You will hear the nervous system at the end, a little bit of smoke on the water. Okay, so we have a lot to work with this information. So the information that we are able to capture actually physically resembles the sound waves. So we can get a very detailed understanding of, well, the effects of aging. What aspects of, how does aging affect the transmission of certain aspects of sound? And again, it does not affect every aspect of sound equally. No, not at all. So it's experience dependent on different time scales, lifelong experience, so the languages we speak, the music we make over our lives, short-term training, say you might work on something for 2 or 3 months, and even online, we know, like in the moment, that the way that we listen, and I mean, even just during this lecture, you might be paying more attention or listening to some aspect of what I'm saying in a different way earlier than later. You can see that the changes that happen when we have lifelong experience are huge. They really are profound effects on the nervous system. The online moment-to-moment changes, even the mood changes, these are tiny. They're measurable, they're there, they're tiny, compared to the enormous changes that occur in our nervous system based on the many, many, many hours. The more hours you log into something, the more your nervous system changes according to what we do. We are what we do. Here's an example, another example of, here's stimulus. And you will see responses, one from a musician and one from a non-musician. And I'm going to play it 3 times. But you can both see and hear just the way the nervous system will process this scale differently. Okay, so these are aspects, very basic aspect of sound. And so our approach, if you will, gives us a biological snapshot that our hearing involves sensory, cognitive, and reward processes. All of those things are captured in the biological responses that we're able to capture from human beings, no matter, we can capture these in newborn babies and in very old people who may or may not want to be, we work with adolescents, and sometimes they really don't want to be where they are. It doesn't matter what mood they're in, their brain will give us the kind of response that we will pick up just based on what their experience has been in sound. Okay, so what can I tell you? Musicians do have stronger sound processing in the brain. One of the first studies we did is we measured responses to music in musicians and non-musicians, and it's not hugely surprising that musicians might have stronger responses to musical sounds. But what was really revealing here is that we found this transfer, this enormous transfer, that people who had musical experience had enhanced responses to speech sounds. And we see this across the lifespan. And one of the things that I'd like you to see is that with experience, so the red guys are the musicians, this builds up with experience. It builds up over the years. This is one of the good things that happen as we get older. Some things really get better. If you take a complicated pitch, so a pitch that changes very, very quickly, much, much faster than a note will in music. If you go here from a higher pitch to a lower pitch and then a higher pitch again, it sounds like this.
Da.
Okay. If you have musical experience, your nervous system, again, we can just measure this cycle by cycle. We can measure that your nervous system is very good at tracking that very complex pitch change. It's actually the kind of pitch change that occurs in tonal languages that carry meaning, okay? And people who are not speakers of tonal languages, in fact, it's a train wreck. They are not able, these are not musicians, not tonal language speakers, they are unable to pick up on these minute changes in pitch, which someone with musical experience can do. What about emotional sounds? So here we've got a baby. He's crying. And we can measure the response to the baby's cry. And what we see here, and this is an important point, is for the information-bearing part of the cry, for the part that really tells you how this baby is feeling. You know, is this just one of these make-believe cries, or is the baby hurting? Does he really need attention? And what we see is that people with musical experience have enhanced responses to this information-bearing part of the cry. Interestingly, they have smaller responses to the simple, periodic aspects of sound. So it is as though they are using their neural resources for the tough stuff. They are saving neural resources on the things that really, for a musician, are very, very, very easy to process. And it gives us this concept of selective enhancement. So what I really want you to take away is the fact that based on what we do with our experience with sound, it's not as though your response to sound, it's not a volume knob. It's not as though your response to sound just gets bigger. It's not as though if you are reading impaired, if you're a dyslexic child and you have difficulty processing sounds, it's not that all the sounds are processed poorly. It's specific aspects of sounds that are tricky and that are information-bearing. And those are the parts of sound that we see enhanced in people with musical experience. So we have these musician signature enhancements, and I already talked to you about hearing and noise, auditory working memory, auditory attention. There's a whole rhythm story that I'm sadly not going to be able to get to tonight, but it's fun. But I want to give you a couple of examples of the biology. So consonants. Consonants are very important. They carry key information-bearing elements. So we know that they're vulnerable because they occur very quickly. Compared to a vowel, a consonant is very short. It's quieter. A vowel is much louder. It's very easily masked. You know, like if you're listening to somebody in another room, you can often hear the vowels, but you can't hear really what they're saying. And so the point is that this processing of consonants can be improved with musical experience. So if you look at, for example, how the nervous system might represent ga and ba, the way that the nervous system represents these differences, long story short, is by neural timing, just how quickly and precisely the neurons can process the particular elements that are associated with one consonant and another. The more red there is, the better timing. So the better the nervous system is able to disambiguate those two sounds. And you can just very easily and objectively see that with our metrics. Musicians are better. Musicians are much better at distinguishing consonants biologically, whether they're paying attention to them or not. Their nervous system just is better at representing these sounds. Hearing, speech, and noise is difficult for everyone. Certain populations are more affected as we get older, as we become hearing impaired. I want to show you some examples here. So if you look at the musician's response to speech in quiet and the non-musician's response in quiet, you see that they're very similar. So in quiet, there isn't such a big difference. But in noise, you don't even have to do the fancy analyses that we do to just see. First, there are two things that you can notice here. A of all, the musician's response is not even affected by the noise. It's as though the noise isn't there. The musician's response in quiet and in noise are almost identical. And the non-musician is really taking a hit in noise. And you can hear this in the brain's response. First, I want you to hear the musician's responses in quiet and in noise. And you'll hear that they really are quite similar. There are some subtle differences, but they're quite similar. Now let's listen to the non-musicians and noise. This is to a speech sound. Not as musical, is it, in the non-musician? So this is a really great quote. So our friend Darwin, this is what he said. I've got to read this. He said, "If I were to live my life again, I would have made a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week, for perhaps the parts of my brain now atrophied would thus have been kept active through use." He's a smart guy. So what happens with aging? So communication challenges. Hearing and noise becomes more difficult, as it's one of the most common complaints of an older person. Memory, again, these are two big common complaints. And as these things fail, they lead to enormous social problems, and they lead to social isolation and depression because people don't seek out interactions. They don't go to birthday parties anymore. They don't go to restaurants. They won't put themselves in a situation which is so frustrating where they can't hear and they can't remember because the memory and the hearing, because sensory and cognitive systems are completely intertwined, they interact with each other. So if you're having a hard time hearing, you're going to have a hard time remembering. If you have a hard time remembering, you're going to have a hard time hearing. And so biologically, again, this is work done by others, showing that, one of the things that we just know is that as nervous systems in humans and animals age, neural timing, which is so important for distinguishing sounds, for all kinds of things, it just slows down. We know that there are increased inhibitory processes that ordinarily sharpen what it is that we want to hear. There's broader neural tuning. There's longer neural recovery, which means once a neuron fires, it takes longer for the neuron to recover and fire again when another sound comes. There is increased neural noise. This is a big deal because if you think about the static on your radio, it's this background noise that is getting in the way of your hearing what it is that the announcer is saying. And there's decreased brain connectivity. It's very important, again, because hearing and learning and communicating involve our cognitive, sensory, and reward systems, these connections among the different parts of our brain that subserve these things and that operate as a circuit. And it's so funny, as scientists, we have ourselves in these societies, and there are people who study the ear and people who study the reward system or memory. And in fact, the brain doesn't work that way. The brain works very much as an entity. And yet we have these departments that study individual parts of this, which of course is important. But it is also extremely important to be considering the whole. And so these connections just become impeded as we get older. So, did you say bill or pill? Typical consonant confusion, kind of important. So, look at this. If you look at the response to, here's the consonant, the B and the P in pill. As we get older, the timing is just later in the older people, which are shown in black, and the younger guys are shown in blue. So we have shown very clearly that if you measure, as using the metrics that we measure, if I measure your response to a consonant, it will have a certain time. It will occur at a certain time. And if you are older, it will occur later in time than if you are younger. And it only, again, occurs to the consonant part. The vowel, there isn't even a very big difference between older and younger people in the processing of vowels, because vowels are easy. If you look at consistency, what we see is that if you present a sound, and then you present a sound again, and you present a sound again, if you're a young, healthy nervous system, you will get more or less the same response by the nervous system each time. If you are older, what happens is that the nervous system response gets jittered. So you have a much less consistent response from time to time. that's going to pose some problems. Synchrony. It's important for neurons to fire together. That is one of the ways that signals are interpreted by us, because neurons are making a lot of noise together, and they are firing in a synchronous manner, which you can see here. These are neurons firing together, and the synchrony, these are younger people, these are older people. And you can see that we lose neural synchrony. We also lose the representation of harmonics, which again are very important not only for consonants and vowels, but they are important in distinguishing the sound of a piccolo and a bassoon playing the same note is distinguished by the differences in harmonics. And again, the older people have diminished processing of this important information-bearing element. So again, if you look at a young adult compared to an older adult's response, let's listen to them. So this is again to a speech sound, to da. Okay? And we do know that there is evidence in both animals and in humans that as we get older, we can learn constantly. We can learn and learn and learn and learn until we die. So let me tell you a little bit about this. So we know from some very elegant animal studies where what they have done is they have given animals, so owls localize their prey by figuring out, they listen for, if you close your eyes and you hear a sound, your ears are able, your nervous system, your brain computes the relative intensity and time that the sound is hitting each one of the ears at the same at a given moment, and with that information can say, my mouse is over there. Well, you can put prisms on the owl and shift their visual field so that even though his auditory system, his neurons are telling him the mouse is over here, the mouse is actually over here. So the question that they asked was, could the owl be taught, if he's wearing these prisms, could he change his nervous system's response to sound to now match up with this new visual input? Because things change, and and as we get older, things change. Can our brains change accordingly? And the answer is really yes. So that here is what we see is that here is the response of the brain to these responses, to the input that they're getting from the two ears. And with training, the animal learns to shift his map of space in sound very, very easily. But in an older animal, so the first set of studies were actually kind of disappointing. The older animal was unable to shift their responses to sound. But then they figured out, well, what about if instead of putting these prisms on and shifting the visual field by 15 degrees all at once, we do it in smaller increments? And look at that. The older animal learned very well, just as well and just as quickly as the younger animal. So this is why it's really important to study these things, because as we understand strategies, we understand not only, A of all, the older nervous system is entirely capable of reorganizing itself and learning, and we also are learning what are the best strategies. This is other work. This is in the auditory cortex of the rat. And what we have, this is work that has come out of Mike Merzenek's lab. And what he has found is these little red dots, I don't know if you can see them, are denoting every time a sound occurs. And in an older animal, you see that there's a lot of jitter between when the sound occurs and when the neurons fire. And what he found is that after he trained the animals to become better listeners, he found that that jitter, these are now single neuron responses, the responses of those single neurons became more aligned with the sound. So we know, we're standing on the shoulders of very clear, very beautifully performed animal experiments when now we're turning to humans and we're trying to understand, well, what about humans? So we've done a series of studies using computer-based training, and I'm going to talk about that briefly, and then I'm going to get to music. So you may have heard of Brain Fitness. This is a program by Posit Science, and it's based on two principles. You adaptively contract elements that are important actually for consonants, because we know that these are parts of speech that become more difficult to hear. And the other thing that happens is that the memory demands and the attention demands are increased. So these are all, both the sensory and the cognitive components of learning and of learning speech are put together in a computer game. And here are some examples. Let me just show you. So here you can take something like bid, and you can play it very slowly.
Bid.
Versus
Bid.
okay? And you can do this on a syllable level, on a word level, on a sentence level. You can. This is like a memory game where you remember where the sounds are. So you're constantly. It's kind of fun for a while. Anyway, what we did is we had a study of 75 older adults, and we brought them to Northwestern University, which is where I'm based. And we had them go through 8 weeks of this training. This was 40 minutes a day, 5 days a week. We also had an active control, because it's not really fair to give one group something to do and another group nothing. So our active control is the people watched educational videos for the same amount of time, and they also had to answer questions about what they were listening to. And then we tested them again. And we measured, of course, the biological responses to sound, how they heard a noise, and their memory, both at the beginning and again at the end. And what we found is, well, remember, in respect to consonants, that the timing is later, and this is what we expected in the pre-training situation. After training, we found a significant change in the nervous system's, a shortening, a speeding up of the nervous system's response to these consonants. And we didn't see a change in the active controls. Okay, and this is published in PNAS. You can see it, the details. We looked at hearing and noise, and again, what we found is that there was a significant improvement in the people's ability to hear speech and noise relative to the active controls after the training. The same for auditory working memory. We saw that there was a change in the experimental group and not in the control group. But now, what about lifelong musical experience? Okay, so this is, I think, one of the reasons that you're here. So a musician, again, defined as I have defined them. What about lifelong musical experience, and how might a person who has played music all of their lives consistently, how might they compare to these individuals who have gone through this short-term auditory training? So remember, as we're older, the timing to consonants is later, and this is a younger adult. Where do you think the musicians are going to lie? Do you think they'll be maybe somewhere in the middle? The older musicians? Somewhere in the middle? These are the data. So what we find is, in terms of their nervous system, in terms of the nervous system response to this very important element of sound, we find that the older musician's brain, these are 65-year-old and older people, that their brains are biologically younger. Remember I said, if you looked at response consistency, so how consistent is your nervous system at responding to sound? Well, what we know is, as we get older, your response consistency gets worse. Here's your musician. We looked at phase locking, which is neural synchrony, and again, as you get older, you lose the ability of neurons to fire together. Look at the older musicians. The older musicians are here. They, again, are indistinguishable biologically from the young adults. And finally, when we look at the harmonics, the representation of the harmonics, that lower panel, the red guys are the musicians, and they are much, much better than their older cohorts, and again, they are looking like young adults. So we find this really pretty interesting. And so if you contrast lifelong music and short-term training, lifelong music, first of all, has a much more profound effect, but of course it would. This is lifelong. And also it affects different components of the processing of sound, whereas what we found with the computer-based training is that only one aspect of biological processing was affected. But they all show communication benefits. But again, the communication benefits are stronger, much stronger, for the musicians than for the people who played the computer games. So here is your younger adult, your older adult, and your older adult musician, which, I mean, you can see is just biologically indistinguishable. I mean, I can walk through the lab and someone is being tested and I can just tell. I can say, oh, you're testing a musician. I can just see that. It's obvious. What about if you have hearing loss? So one of the things that happens as we get older is we start to lose our hearing. And so what we wanted to do was to compare musicians who have hearing loss with age-matched people who did not have hearing loss. And so remember I told you before that both for hearing a noise and for auditory working memory, musicians, and these are musicians without hearing loss, are better than non-musicians. Now, if you look at the musicians with hearing loss, they're still pretty good. So the hearing loss is really not having very much of an impact. It's having some impact, but not very much. And of course, the greater the hearing loss you have, the bigger the impact you will have. But it's very interesting to me that the musical experience will actually trump the peripheral damage that just happens to our ear as we get older. So again, if we contrast music with other forms of training, we can see that the older musician, again, just has these much more pronounced effects of training than do older adults who have gone through this training. And again, contrasting the computer-based training with music training, this is whether or not you have a hearing loss. The effects even on these communication skills like hearing a noise and memory are just much smaller. They're much more modest when you're playing these computer games for a short amount of time than if you have spent a life playing music consistently. Putting some of this in perspective, I think, is interesting. If you compare an older musician, their hearing a noise is about as good as a younger person's, but it's more variable. So when you have an older person, you have some older people who do really, really well as a young adult, but there are some who are still doing better than non-musicians, but the performance as a group is more variable. And the same is true with memory. What happens if you stop playing music? Does the nervous system continue to profit? So how many of you have played music as kids and no longer play? That's a lot of people. And this is the typical case. So the answer is resoundingly yes. So what we have done here is we looked at about 50 Northwestern students and we matched them in every possible way except for the amount of experience they have had in childhood playing music, and they're no longer playing. And what we found was that their ability, both of the nervous system, to pull out the signal and to have a less static, less background noise was much improved, significantly improved, if they had more than 5 years of training as kids, even though they no longer are playing anymore. And so this translates into a signal-to-noise situation where you have less neural background noise and you are better able to make sense of the signal. And very nicely, the group that had intermediate training nestled in between. What about older adults? So this is work that we're currently writing up. We know that, again, if you have no musical experience, that you have this very delayed timing to sound. If you have had just a couple of years of musical training in your background, that actually mitigates that. And we also see that if you've had a moderate amount of training, even if you're not playing now, that there actually is a measurable effect of your past experience on your current performance. And so this, to me, is really one of the reasons that music education is so very important, because you are, and we know this from controlled animal work as well, animals that have been exposed to certain enrichments and to poverty, if you will perform differently when they are adult animals. And we see this very, very clearly with music. I just want to tell you that we are studying, I'm not going to tell you anything about the data, but we are very interested in looking at musical education. And we have 2 projects, one in Chicago and one in LA. We are following kids longitudinally as they undergo music instruction. We're looking at their biology and their learning outcomes. These are all low SES kids. I want to point out that Margaret Martin is in the audience here, right over there. You might stand up just for a second, so if anybody wants to talk to her. She's the founder of Harmony Project in LA, winner of 2 presidential awards for that work. But really, what is so needed in education are biological outcomes to guide policy, and that's what we're working on. So I'm just going to sum things up. Aging is the anti-music. It impedes hearing a noise, memory, and the biological processing of sound, and music promotes all of these things. We think this is happening because the shaping of the neural processing of sound is shaped by the sound to meaning connections that are made, whether we're speaking or when we are engaged in music, and music is so important for that. I like, David Pizzoni has what he calls the auditory scaffolding hypothesis. He says, active experience with sound creates the scaffolding for the development and maintenance of communication skills, and especially of cognitive abilities. So how we interact with sound shapes how neurons, how our biology responds to the sound through the sensory, cognitive, and reward network. This leads to more effective neural representation of sounds. It helps us pay attention to and remember, make sense out of what we hear, and we have access to this biology in humans. The important research gaps are, what about if you are an adult? And somebody's, I'm sure, was going to ask, what if you are an adult and you want to initiate or resume musical training later in life? There are no data speaking to that right now, and this is a gap that we're hoping to be able to fill. Is music unique? How does it contrast with other forms of training? And these educational issues are, of course, very near to our hearts. And we're working on trying to obtain large-scale outcomes using our biological approach. So this, again, is something that we are very interested in, being able to translate our technology into a platform that can be used by investigators studying all kinds of things across the lifespan where they want an objective, ironclad biological metric. And we think that initiating music in life late should work. And we think this is the case because music is powerful. And I'm just going to tell you for a second Ani Patel's opera hypothesis. The O stands for the overlap in language and music in both the biology and the signal. The P stands for precision. We tolerate a lot of imprecision in language, different accents. We cannot tolerate imprecisions of a semitone in music. E is emotion. O-P-E-R, repetition. And A is attention. We have to learn what to pay attention to. Last grand summary here is we are what we do. So I hope you take that away. We are what we do. Auditory biology is not frozen in time. It's a moving target. Music enhances sound processing for communication skills. Aging affects communication, hearing, and noise, and memory, and it offsets a lifelong of playing music will offset these aging effects. And we see this with limited musical training early in life. It trumps age-related hearing loss. And our question is, what about musical training initiated later in life? Auditory experience provides a scaffolding for cognitive function. And our biological approach is really a I think it is the most sensitive metric we have of auditory learning and of how the nervous system responds to important acoustic elements of sound that is experience dependent. And it is really one of our goals to try to make this technology, I mean, really the technology is something that could be operated on our cell phones with a headband. But right now it is captured inside of very complex dinosaur-type equipment that is very difficult to use and very expensive. These are the wonderful people in my lab that are performing the work. And in particular, Trent Nickel, Erica Skoy, Samira Anderson, Alexandria Parber-Clark, Dana Straight, and Travis White-Swak are the people responsible for the work I've talked to you about today. We are very, very, very grateful for the support that we get federally from the NIH and from other sources. And I'm going to leave you with our website and a plug for it. I hope that you will take these little cards. And what I would like you to know about our website is that we have a tremendous responsibility, we feel, for you to understand the little discoveries that we make, and we feel like we want to communicate them to you. If you look at our different lab projects, music, reading, aging, under each one of those projects is a slideshow for the general public that will show you one picture, one line of text that summarizes 2 or 3 years of work. And in 5 minutes, you'll get an overview of what we have done, where we're going. And of course, if you want the nitty-gritty, you can download the publications and go as deep as you want. And I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. We'll do a little transition here. Isn't that fascinating? I'm sure those of you who are lifelong musicians picked up a lot more of the subtleties than the rest of us did. But now when Dr. Wagster and Dr. Bernard make their way to the stage, let me tell you a little bit about this distinguished panel that we have. Dr. Marie Bernard is the Deputy Director of the National Institutes on Aging. She was a member of NIA's National Advisory Council between 2002 and 2005. And she recently served as president of the Association for Gerontology in Higher Education and as president and chair of the board of the Association of Directors of Geriatric Academic Programs. And she's always been a big friend of the National Center for Creative Aging. We have the executive director here, Gay Hanna, for National Center for Creative Aging. Dr. Molly Wagster is the Chief Behavioral and Systems Neuroscience Branch at NIH. Dr. Wagster came to NIA from the Department of Pathology, the Division of Neuropathology at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where she investigated neural mechanisms of learning and memory changes with age in animal models, and she studied changes in neuroreceptor mechanisms in relation to cognitive decline in neurodegenerative diseases, such as Alzheimer's disease and Huntington's disease. So, format now is I'm going to turn it over to these two distinguished panelists, and they're going to ask Nina some questions.
Okay, so I'm Marie Bernard, and the things to remember of the things he mentioned are that I'm a geriatrician and a former cellist, so I'm very interested in Dr. Kraus's work. I'm also, as a member of the NIH community, I'd like to share with you a little bit broader context of some of the things that are going on research-wise related to arts and aging. We're very privileged to have Dr. Jean Cohen's wife here, Dr. Cohen, who had been the Deputy Director of the National Institute on Aging and the Director of the National Institute on Aging a couple of generations back. Started our interest in arts and aging, and we of late have had a collaboration with the National Endowment of the Arts. In fact, with the Office of Behavioral and Social Research and the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, both components of NIH, with the National Endowment of the Arts, had a workshop on arts and aging last fall. Dr. Kraus was one of our speakers, and we had a number of people to come together and talk about the benefit of arts with aging. The conclusions were that the research is not perfectly clear, but it appears that as a result of various arts activities, you can enhance perhaps cognition, you can certainly enhance well-being for individuals, you can have a better quality of life as a result of that. Is it exclusively music? The best research is done with regards to music, led by people like Dr. Kraus. But theater can potentially have a benefit. Creative writing can potentially have a benefit. Dance can potentially have a benefit. Our challenge is to do more thorough and conclusive studies, because the studies that we have thus far are generally small, and you can't compare one study to another because each one is done a little bit differently. We are committed to trying to change that and get a better handle on things. I'll give you an example. Doctors Tony and Helga Noyce, along with Dr. Art Kramer, are people who are doing research with regards to theater and its impact on older individuals. And one of their studies looked at a little more than 100 individuals who went through theater training versus training in singing versus not really doing anything. And they were able to demonstrate that people who went through the theater training had improvement in a number of things related to cognition as compared to the people who went through the training in singing. And both groups had a better sense of well-being than those people who didn't have an intervention. We have Dr. Kramer also looking at issues with regards to how the brain changes with dance. We have a Dr. Julene Johnson who's looking at things such as the impact of choirs for older individuals at adult centers. So we are committed to following through the tradition that was initiated by Dr. Cohen, and again, very pleased to see you here. So now, after all that talking, I'm going to start off with the questions. And I guess the first question we have for you, Dr. Kraus, is why don't musicians actually develop? Some musicians do have hearing loss, you talked about that, but we have the impression that they don't develop as much in the way of hearing loss as others. And, I asked you the question earlier about drummers in particular. Yeah. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Why does that not happen?
Well, this is such an important question. And first of all, we have to protect our hearing. People are so cavalier about their hearing. And my husband is a musician, and he teaches people across the lifespan, but he has a particular interest in adolescence, and we're always going to hear these bands. And these kids are listening to really loud music. And nobody is wearing, and they say, I'm going to make your ears bleed. And they're kind of, proud about this. And yet you see, if there are little kids in the audience, the little kids run out like this because it hurts. So number one, protect your hearing. You can get these musician earplugs. They're made by Etymotic, E-T-Y-M-O-T-I-C, Etymotic. They are fit to your ear canal, and there are little filters that you can put in there that will attenuate sound linearly so that you can attenuate 8 dB, 32 dB, however much you want, and it still will not distort the sound. And the filters are changeable, interchangeable. So if you play music, in fact, if you are exposed to very loud music, you will get noise-induced hearing losses. I'm actually surprised by, especially the younger musicians that we're testing, this really doesn't start showing up until they're about 40, in terms of things that we can measure, although there's some kids that we can see it really early on. But what is interesting, and really that speaks to the power of the brain and the nervous system, is that we really have done studies where we have looked at older people, older musicians with hearing loss, and compared them to older non-musicians with normal hearing. Okay, so you're comparing old and old. One group has normal hearing, and the other group has hearing loss, a mild to moderate presbycusis, age-related hearing loss. And we measure their brain responses, and we measure how do they do in noise, and how is their auditory working memory. And still, the musical experience trumps the peripheral hearing loss. So that musical experience is very, very powerful. It will not cure, it will not stop a hearing loss from happening, but it will very, very, very much protect your communication abilities because of that musical experience, to such an extent that if your hearing loss is really in the mild to moderate range, which is it is for most people as we get older, that it really has no measurable difference. Now, these musicians, if you ask them, is your hearing getting worse? They will say it is, even though it's entirely within the normal range, and they're doing as well, if not better, than people with normal hearing. They can still tell the difference, that something has changed.
Second question. What is it that's most important about the music making? Is it the motor component of it? I mean, what about composers who might spend less time actually making the music? What about people who like to come and hear the orchestra or the opera on a regular basis? You know, what's most important about it?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And really, the doing is absolutely essential. So we have really systematically looked at people who listen to a lot of music, and you will not see these profound effects. And you know, I do like to say that you will not get physically fit by watching spectator sports. But on the other hand, if you are actually making sound to meaning relationships, so if you are a sound engineer, or you're doing the kinds of activities where you are actually engaging in the sound and interacting with it, these are actually studies that are ready to be done, and they have not been done. I would like to actually do some work with bird watchers, because bird watchers are more listeners, right? And they're really associating sound to meaning. But you brought up the motor component, and the motor component, and I did not get a chance to talk about rhythm. It is fundamental. So, you think that the rhythm in music is very explicit, but there is rhythm in speech. And rhythm tells us where meaningful information stops and starts. It's very important for us as we engage with each other to have a certain rhythm going on between us. The connection, again, the connections between our auditory areas and our motor areas are absolutely essential for speaking. I mean, babies learn to speak because they hear the sounds and they learn to move. I mean, there's a whole motor theory of speech development and perception that is based on the fact that you have to be able to be receptive and to modulate what it is that you're hearing with what you are producing, and that also you can be entrained with sounds that are going on outside. I'm going to give you just one piece of information, and this is in the reading literature. It turns out that poor readers are horrible at following along with a beat. So if you're playing a beat and you're just asking them to tap along to a beat, Usha Goswami has done beautiful work in Cambridge, and we've replicated this work. Others have now too. It's very striking. That this ability to entrain to an outside source motorically is very impaired in people who have a language deficit. And we also know that people with musical training, Bruno Repp has done some beautiful studies on this, and we're starting to look at this with our Harmony Project kids. We see that musical experience, not too surprisingly, enhances the ability to entrain motorically with rhythm. And it seems that fundamentally this auditory motor link is evolutionarily important. And it's evolutionarily important also, I'll give you another very interesting fact, I think, which is that animals, you'll never find your dog wagging his tail or tapping his paw to the beat. It's only vocal animals, it's only humans who naturally, little babies will follow along with the beat. People have tried to get monkeys, our closest relatives, evolutionarily, to follow a beat, they can't do it. Some birds can, and birds are vocal learners.
Nina, that was a marvelous lecture, and I learn something every time I hear you give it, even though I don't play a musical instrument. So I'm very worried about my brain now. But I did want to bring up an issue with you, not so much in terms of music, but in terms of age-related hearing loss. So Dr. Frank Lynn, who's an otolaryngologist at Johns Hopkins up the road, has recently shown some data in which older adults who have uncorrected hearing loss, they're not wearing any type of assistive device, actually are at increased risk for development of cognitive impairment and even Alzheimer's disease. And he's been a tireless advocate, I think, for getting older adults or anyone who has any type of hearing loss, to use some type of assistive device. This seems to be a very difficult thing to do, to get people to want to use these types of hearing aids. But I wondered if you would care to comment a little bit on the relationship between hearing loss and cognitive functioning. I know you touched upon it a bit in your lecture, but to expand a bit on it, particularly in the older adult.
I'm so glad that you brought this up. Dr. Lynn's work at Johns Hopkins is extraordinary, and he really has finally made this connection between being able to hear, it's sensory and cognitive, and this, that again, these are interconnected systems. So if you have people who are not getting the signal properly, it impairs your ability to think. I've had this problem with one of my eyes lately, and I can really, I can live this. I can see how, when this is happening, it's much harder to think. So the links between how we perceive sound, all of our senses, and how we think about them, how we use them, how we remember them, how we pay attention to them, this is a seamless circuit. And so if you are proactive and you give yourself the very best hearing aid, this is the best investment. I mean, when I think of where I put my resources, all of my money goes to education and medicine. Hearing aids are expensive, and they're not reimbursable for the most part. But they really, and now Dr. Lynn has actually really has data showing how being able to hear better as an older person impacts cognitive, memory, attention, communication skills. And it's entirely founded in what we understand of the biology. It's entirely consistent with the work that we have been discovering ourselves. And he finally has these beautiful, beautiful, beautiful data that tell, that there's nothing like the data to show us, to tell the story.
So this is sort of in the relationship of music being like a language. And I'm going to put it in the context of bilingualism. So there is some research, again, I'm focusing on older adults, that bilingual older adults or multilingual older adults actually may have greater preservation of their cognitive function and a decreased risk for Alzheimer's disease. This research is a little bit controversial, but nonetheless, there is that implication. Is it possible that the language of music confers some type of similar advantage?
Yeah. So actually, we're studying, because we study learning, and we're studying bilinguals. We study auditory experts, so bilinguals and musicians, and there is enormous overlap, especially in some of these cognitive benefits that. So when you speak another language, it is as though you have that other language in the background all the time. Think of having two windows up on your computer, at the same time, and you're always having to inhibit one language while you're bringing the language that you're listening to into focus. And so what is interesting is ways in which bilingualism and musical experience overlap. In terms of cognitive skills, we see actually with bilingualism across the board for both visual and auditory skills, we see enhancements. With musicians, we see the enhancements primarily in the auditory domain. The visual domain effects are smaller. We find that some of the benefits in terms of the consistency of sound and the ability to bring signals out of noise are enhanced in both bilinguals and in musicians. What we don't see at all in the bilinguals is the ability to process the tricky information-bearing parts of speech like consonants, speech when it's really presented in very, very challenging situations where you're really depending on a very, very, very precise and accurate nervous system that knows how to pay attention to sounds. The other thing that we see with musicians that we haven't yet, to give it credit, we haven't thoroughly looked at with the bilinguals, but what we see with the musicians very clearly is that the way that we understand each other, that we understand our environment, is that we're very good at picking up on patterns in sound. I mean, we learn the languages we speak just because we know what sounds are legal in our language, and we know that certain sounds will occur with higher probabilities than other sounds. If you are a musician, again, defined as I define a musician, your nervous system automatically picks up on sound patterns in extraordinary ways and in ways that we have not yet seen in speakers of multiple languages. But again, if you go to our website, we have a smaller, more modest section on bilingualism, and you can see what it is that we found there. And I love this idea of neural signatures to really understand what is the neural signature for reading, what is the neural signature for musicianship, what is the neural signature for bilingualism, and our understanding of the ways in which, and for aging, the ways in which these intersect and don't is enormously informative about our knowledge of the nervous system.
Terrific. Let's open this up. Any questions here? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let me do it.
Thank you. Fascinating indeed. Most of what Dr. Kraus refers to relates to instrument playing in musicians. What about singers and dancers?
Yes, that's such a good question. So first of all, I can tell you that a lot of research is work that needs to be done. Okay, we are really just establishing effects. What we know right now is that it doesn't matter what instrument you play or the genre of music that you listen to, the profound fundamental effects of the nervous system and a communication will happen irrespective of what you play. However, we have found already, and others have found this as well, that there is a specialization of the specialized. So if you play a bassoon, you are going to respond differently to bassoon sounds than to piano sounds. We currently have a study trying to address your question. We call it DrumVo. We are looking at drummers and vocalists because we are very, very interested and we don't have the answers for you yet. Again, we are seeing some of the fundamental changes occurring that we see in other musicians. As a vocalist, your instrument is your body, but we're also seeing some differences. And so it's just an open question at the moment, and I think a really important one. Thank you.
Dr. Kraus.
Yes, sir.
When you study people who are lifetime musicians with the advanced skills and experience and abilities, how does that generalize? What else can they do? Can people who can follow the melody follow data? Can they pick out stock?
Here's what they. I wish they could pick out stock. So what they can do is they can pick out sounds in foreign languages faster and better, and Myriel Besson has done some beautiful work along those lines. But I think they are better at language skills. And so I think very importantly, and this is a gap that we're trying to make very tight, but what we are seeing is that a very important component of the language is literacy. And really the skills, many of the skills that we see impaired in poor readers are exactly the skills, and we see this biologically as well as behaviorally, are exactly the skills that are enhanced by musicianship. And so language skills, and in general auditory memory skills, which are important whether it's music or language, and attention, auditory attention, and being able to react to sound, whether it's a musical sound or another sound in one's environment, these are things that are enhanced in people with musical training, general things.
Generalized outside of auditory.
Not as much. It does, so here the data are, Laurel Traynor and Corrigal have a very nice review on this. There are some studies that have shown, everyone agrees that the auditory skills are enhanced to a greater extent than the visual skills. Some studies have failed to find visual effects. Some have found visual effects, but to a lesser degree. That's where the field is now.
Dr. Kraus, has there been any data on the effects of trying to reactivate or retrain former inactive musicians and its effect on, let's say, aging processes?
Well, that is literally the million-dollar question. So this is a research gap. And one of the things that I'm hoping to be able to do, and I hope that other scientists are going to address this issue, is what about people who have played music early in life, but they haven't played for decades? And we know, at least in some of the work that we've already done, we know that even though your musical experience early in childhood will help you when you stop, when you're a young adult and an older adult, there's still a recency effect. So the longer you played and the more current your playing experience is, the stronger your effects. What we really don't know is what about if you have had prior experience, you now have not played for decades, 20, 30 years, what is your nervous system's ability to assess and to reorganize based on that prior experience compared to someone who is initiating musical experience for the first time as an older person. So this is, I think, such an important question, and one that, because music seems to be such a powerful model for learning, it would seem, music is self-sustaining more than perhaps a computer game, although some people might prefer computer games. But, with music, you'll never get good enough. It is just something that keeps you going. But this is an unanswered question, a question that has no answer today, and I hope that someday I'll be able to answer your question with data.
Let me ask a question to follow up on that. We hear that with language, for example, there's a sweet spot, like say between 2 and 8 or something like that, where we just learn language automatically. Is there any similar type of developmental thing that goes on with music? I mean, do we learn it more easily when we're young?
Yeah, and we learn it differently. We learn it differently. We know that we can learn it at any time, but there are sweet spots, and so others have shown, and we have shown, that if you begin musical training early, that it's like with a language or with a motor skill, and you'll learn it in a different way. Remember the OWL studies. But what we've been able to already see in our work with second graders with the Harmony Project in LA and with our underserved adolescents in Chicago. So these are people who have never had musical experience before. One group is second graders, the other group is adolescents. With the adolescents, after 1 year of music training, we saw no effects on the nervous system, and on their behavior. After 2 years, we're now seeing some reorganization and some effects. With the Harmony Project kids who are second graders, already in 1 year, we're seeing more than we were able to see in the freshman adolescents. So,
well, I have sort of a complicated question, but I'm going to not do the complicated part. But you've talked a lot about music education, and you've talked a lot about visual versus auditory. And so one of my questions is, when you talk about musical education, do you make the distinction between the types of musical education that are very visual versus like a Suzuki method? Like,
right.
Let's take piano, for example.
Oh.
And well, that leads to something very complicated that I don't think we can do at the end here, because our daughter was born with an auditory processing issue, and we chose to have her learn Suzuki music at age 5, and she's been playing for the next, well, she's 18. So, and she took Suzuki that entire time. So I have a personal sort of part to it. But more theoretically, it seems to me that there is a distinction there, and I'm wondering if
absolutely.
Okay.
And so think about, well, you have thought about the difference.
Yes.
You can learn music, as many people do, when they're 5 or 6 years old, kind of at the same time that they're learning to read. And they're learning to read music as well, and they're learning it score-based. You can learn music Suzuki style like a language. So it is much more implicit. It is orally based. Actually, with drumming, there are these fabulous drumming traditions in India and in Bali where they're entirely oral, right. So all auditory. So again, these are questions that really scientifically have not been put to the test and need to be. So, we and others are really looking at what about the different types of music making. What about if you learn music as a language orally? What about if you learn it through music? We have reading music. We have very detailed questionnaires, and actually we are getting some inkling of what's going on. I'm conservative. I don't really want to tell you things I'm not sure about yet. But we're looking at improvisers versus people who are score-based. The other thing that we don't have data on that is so important that you have brought up is all of the data that we have to date on the effects of musical experience on the nervous system have been obtained in people who are privileged enough to afford private instruction, who have had one-on-one instruction. We know nothing about musical education from a biological standpoint. What about music education delivered in schools, delivered in group settings? And these are, and this is where Julene Johnson's work with older adults who are in groups of choruses, this kind of work, because it's something that communities can sustain. And that can really impact how we as a society decide to invest our resources. And these questions need to have scientific outcome answers.
I'm sure there are many more questions. You can join us all afterwards for a reception. You can drink some wine, and both Dr. Wagster, Dr. Bernard, Dr. Kraus, we'll all be there. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lauren Campbell, who conceived and created this whole program. So let's have a...
Thank you so much. This has been incredible. So can we just thank them one more time for being here?